Well, we are through with chapter 3 and on into chapter 4 now. Did everybody get a chance to at least skim through chapter 4? Did chapter 4 feel a little bit more comprehensible than chapter 3 and chapter 2? Okay, part of that is because chapter 4 is simpler than chapter 3 and chapter 2 were. Part of that is that you're getting more used to this. Like as you get more used to kind of the sorts of things that Lee Strobel is talking about, they get easier to comprehend. Little by little, it's one of those things where you don't even realize that you're getting better as you're getting better. You just look back and you see how much better you're able to understand these things now than before. So I'd be willing to bet that if you went back and you reread chapter 1, you don't have to, but if you did, you would find it much more understandable than you did when you first read chapter 1. Same thing with chapter 2, same thing with chapter 3. That's kind of how this works, right? The more familiar you get with a subject, the more familiar you get with kind of the way that you have to think through difficult things, the simpler they become when you go back and revisit them. I hope you've had that same experience with the Bible itself. I hope that today you're able to open quite a bit of the Bible and start reading, and it makes a whole lot more sense than it did back in October of 2018 when I first got here. One of the things I've been trying to do the last 3 years, the time kind of flew, right? But one of the things I've been trying to do over the last 3 years is kind of lay down the groundwork that makes it easier for you to read and understand and apply and interpret the Bible, even when you don't have a guy in the pulpit taking you step by step and explaining all of it. So whether it's with this book or the Bible itself or any other kinds of things, the deeper you get into it, the more comprehensible it becomes, so that today you can probably read increasingly complicated stuff in the fields that Lee Strobel is talking about, and it would make a lot more sense to you, even though it's more complicated, than some of the simpler stuff that he talked about at the beginning would. So, that's a good sign. But today we want to talk about the subject of chapter 4. And the subject of chapter 4 is, what do we know about Jesus apart from the Bible? What all do we know about Jesus apart from what the Bible tells us? What can we learn about Jesus without ever opening our Bibles? If you take a step back, look at Jesus purely as a historical figure, just the way you would like Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great or any other major historical figure. If you take a step back, look at Jesus purely as a historical figure, what can you learn about him? Bar off the Bible. Refuse to allow yourself to pull from it as a source. And what can you learn about Jesus? We're going to talk about what we know about Jesus apart from the Bible. We're going to use 4 specific sources that the chapter pulls from. There are plenty more sources that we could pull from. There's, I want to say, about 39 ancient texts that are not the Bible that you could draw from and learn quite a bit about Jesus. But we want to talk just about these main 4. The reason being, these main 4 are remarkably helpful sources from a historiographical standpoint. That's a big word, right? Historiographical. But we want to look at the historiography of Jesus. We're going to talk about something that scholars call the historical Jesus. And I've been saying it over and over and over, but I want to be repetitious to kind of hammer it into your head. When scholars talk about the historical Jesus, what they're talking about is, what do you get when you strip away everything from the Bible, look purely at the kind of secular historical sources that a historian would look at. When you look purely at those available sources, what do you learn about Jesus? You learn what the bare bones, irreducible, historical Jesus was, minus all of the biblical stuff. We're going to talk about that today. Spoiler alert, what we're going to find is that when you put everything that you can learn about the historical Jesus together and you look at it chronologically, you step back and you look at the bigger picture, that the non-biblical sources about Jesus report, you find that the historical Jesus looks very much like the biblical Jesus. You find that it's almost certain that the biblical Jesus is the historical Jesus. That when you take the historical Jesus that you find from the non-biblical sources and you place him next to the biblical Jesus that you find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're the same picture. Ever see the show The Office? There's an episode where Pam, one of the characters, she keeps going around the office and she says, corporate needs you to find the differences between these two pictures, but it's a prank. It like cuts to her in a side room just talking to the camera. She's like, it's the same picture. So she's trolling everybody. When you look at the historical Jesus and the biblical Jesus and you try to find the differences between the two pictures, it ends up being a Pam from The Office. It ends up being the same picture. But that's kind of the too long, didn't read version of this. We want to go through the long version, right? What do we know about Jesus apart from the Bible? What can we learn about the historical Jesus? So, what all do y'all remember from the chapter before we dive deep in?
That there was true evidence that he existed with these four people.
Yeah.
So these four provided the evidence that he existed.
That's good, yeah. There was true evidence that he existed. It's become increasingly popular, probably within the last 20 years or so, to argue that Jesus probably never actually existed. Now, when I say it's become increasingly popular, I mean popular, not respectable. So if you talk to respected historians in the field, every single one of them is going to say, yeah, obviously Jesus existed. This isn't even a question, right? But if you ask internet dudes with like blogs on like internet forums, on websites that somebody just launched from their mom's basement, then you're going to find the claim that Jesus never existed a whole lot. Same thing with a lot of like internet documentaries, right? There's a really popular internet documentary called Zeitgeist. Ever seen that one? It came out probably 2006, 2007. There were a handful of Zeitgeist movies. The first one claimed that Bush did 9/11. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about here, right? Zeitgeist 1 was all about Bush did 9/11. 9/11 was an inside job. You're being lied to, right? That was really popular. It went viral. They made a lot of money off of it, so they made a Zeitgeist 2. But, you know, when your thing is peddling conspiracy theories, you just have to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And so they had to go bigger than Bush did 9/11. How do you get bigger than Bush did 9/11? Zeitgeist 2 was about how you've been lied to your whole life because Jesus never existed. That was Zeitgeist 2. Then you ended up with a whole kind of weird thing because a whole lot of folks who really liked Zeitgeist 1 were suddenly like, whoa, hold on a second. Now you're taking aim at Jesus. That's not what I was here for, right? I like those conspiracy theories. I don't like these conspiracy theories, right? I want the good conspiracy theories. I don't want the bad ones. And the good ones are whatever I do like, and the bad ones are whatever I don't like, you know. So Zeitgeist 2 kind of alienated a lot of people who liked Zeitgeist 1, but it also popularized the idea that Jesus never existed. And so for the last 20 years, the kind of rebellious kid at your high school who spends a lot of time on the internet looking up like, you know, like Satan stuff, right? They probably got into the claim that Jesus never existed, right? So it's like, Mom, I'm not going to church anymore because Jesus never existed. I learned about it on the internet, right? Same kind of thing, a whole bunch of ebooks started popping up. Guys like Frank Zindler, a guy named Michael Martin, a whole bunch of other kind of just internet goons like conspiracy theorist hacks really picked up the Jesus never existed train and then just sort of ran with it and then monetized it and then made a lot of money off of it. If you go home and you Google Jesus never existed, the first couple of pages on Google are all like self-published books by some dude writing from his living room. It's all Jesus never existed. Here's 10 reasons why, followed by a whole bunch of really, really sketchy historical arguments that would never hold up if you were going through like a peer review process, or if you were presenting them before like a society of historians. The processes that real historians have to go through before their work can be published, none of the Jesus never existed books or blogs or anything, none of them ever had to go through that review process. And so as a result, nobody takes them seriously except for 14-year-olds who are looking for something deep to believe, extreme conspiracy theorists, and people who want to avoid having to be subject to the claims of the Christian faith. So yeah, there is immense evidence that Jesus absolutely existed. In a sane world, you wouldn't have to make the case that Jesus existed, because people in a sane world wouldn't be drawn to these kinds of out there conspiracy theories. But we don't live in a sane world. We live in this world, right? And so you do. So yeah, that's good. There's immense evidence that Jesus really existed. I'm trying to figure out what spots I need to stand in without getting feedback. That's good. What else? What stuck out to you from the chapter?
Well, when I need to be younger, I read about in here how the purpose of persecuting all of those Christians, they were amazed and were trying to figure out why they wouldn't back off and would be killed.
Yeah.
And I thought about today, over in Afghanistan, all of these Christians who are being killed today, they're being beheaded. It's the same thing that went on back then, but they know Jesus exists, and they believe the Bible, and they want people to know they're willing to die for them because he died for them.
That's good. That's really good. Yeah. So you can see parallels between today and yesterday.
Well, it's happening, and we Christians need to be praying. I don't know how those churches are standing it. I mean, I've read, and I say I've read on the Christian news, and I say that I always preface it, but I understand that they would kill the families first, so the preacher that preached the gospel had to watch their children beheaded, and then they would kill them. That is Satan in action.
So these people that write these blogs about Jesus never existed, is that pretty much the way atheists would think?
Not necessarily. So like an intellectually honest atheist knows perfectly well that Jesus existed. They don't necessarily believe that he was like what the Bible says about him, but they know that he existed. So the idea that Jesus never existed, that's like a far fringe theory. It's very far out there. It's like, it's similar to like if you believe that the moon landing was faked, right? You know people who believe that? Maybe some of you do believe that, I don't know, right? If the moon landing was faked, that would actually be awesome, right? So the moon landing conspiracy theory goes that the US faked the moon landing to cause Soviet Russia to waste a ton of money trying to build something to go to the moon so that the US could get the leg up in the Cold War. Personally, I think that's a way cooler story than that we actually went to the moon, because who cares about going to the moon? What does it accomplish? It's a waste of time and money. But bankrupting the Soviet Union is an awesome way to go. So that's a cool conspiracy theory, but it's still stupid. Like, it's still dumb, So the theory goes that, I got too excited. The theory goes that Stanley Kubrick, the guy who made 2001: A Space Odyssey, filmed a fake moon landing because he was able to fake space travel because he learned all that on the set of 2001, A Space Odyssey. Thing is, like, the special effects in 2001, A Space Odyssey don't actually look that good, right? They don't look anything as good as what the moon landing looks like. It would actually be unbelievably difficult to fake something like that and it not leak out, right? Even back in 1969, there was still such a thing as paparazzi, right? There were still tabloids, there was still industry gossip and stuff like that. If you were faking the moon landing, it would have gotten out. It's actually really, really hard to keep something like that a secret, you know? The world does not work like the X-Files. The world does not work like any of that kind of stuff. And so the moon landing was not fake, but there are people like who are rabidly devoted to the belief that the moon landing was fake, just like there are people rabidly devoted to the belief that Bush did 9/11, right? And so the idea that Jesus didn't exist is in kind of the same class as the belief that the moon landing was faked, or that Bush did 9/11. There are people who believe it, but they're mostly cranks and teenagers. That's really the two groups, right? So some atheists believe that Jesus never existed, but most of them get that he existed. Just like they get that we went to the moon, just like they get that Bush probably did not do 9/11. Same kind of thing, right? So the idea that Jesus never existed, that's a far fringe conspiracy theory. And it's had kind of a popular flare-up over the last 20 years, but that's just because these things happen. Conspiracy theories will gain a whole lot of credence for a while, and they'll sort of fade down, and people will forget them, and then a different one will gain a lot of credence, and then it'll kind of fade away. And so the Jesus never existed conspiracy theory, that's a pretty fringe thing. So you're not going to meet that many people who believe it. Most of the ones that you meet are going to be people who are very conspiracy-minded, or they're going to be 14-year-olds, like I said. They're going to be going through the rebellious teenage phase where they say, you know, screw you, Mom, I'm never going to church again, God is fake, Jesus never existed. That's where you're going to see this. And so that's where that's going to be useful. So yeah, there you go. Any other things that really stuck out to you from the chapter? Okay. So, with all that out of the way, we're not primarily going to talk about whether or not Jesus existed, because we're just going to take the word of 99% of historians at face value and say, Jesus existed. What we want to talk about is not whether Jesus existed. What we want to talk about is what Jesus was actually like. So last week, we talked a little bit about all those alternative gospels, right? According to the Da Vinci Code, you can't learn the truth about Jesus from the four Gospels. You have to read the Gospel of Mary. You have to read the Gospel of Philip. You have to read the Gospel of Thomas. You have to read the Gospel of Judith, and so on and so forth. All these alternative Gospels. They say you've got to read the secret Gospels if you want the real truth about Jesus, because the four Gospels are lying to you. But the rejected Gospels, the secret Gospels, those are telling you the truth. We talked a little bit about that. So that's the first perspective on this. They'll say, if you want the truth about Jesus, you have to look at the alternative Gospels. That's what other conspiracy theorists tend to say, right? So the Da Vinci Code, the Jesus Seminar, we talked about them as well. But then very few serious scholars actually think that the secret Gospels have anything useful to tell us about Jesus. Serious scholars pretty much universally understand that the Gospel of Thomas is full of it. The Gospel of Mary is full of it. The Gospel of Philip is full of it, and so on and so forth. They put zero stock in any of those secret Gospels to tell us anything useful about Jesus. That's entirely kind of the purview of conspiracy theorists, Da Vinci Code people, and the director of RoboCop, So, the Jesus Seminar, I don't know if you remember this from chapter 3, but the Jesus Seminar has a handful of serious scholars, and then it has a whole bunch of people who are not scholars in the field of New Testament studies at all. And so like Paul Verhoeven, director of RoboCop, one of my favorite movies, but for whatever reason, he's part of the Jesus Seminar. So when you read about the Jesus Seminar from chapter 3 that Lee Strobel talks about, remember that you're not talking about the foremost scholars in the field. You're talking about a handful of scholars like Marcus Borg, John Crossan. Those are well-respected guys. You're talking about a handful of well-respected scholars and a bunch of randos. Just a bunch of random dudes who are for some reason in the room. So like the director of movies like RoboCop, Total Recall, the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, another awesome movie, right? Paul Verhoeven, a Hollywood director who has no expertise in the field at all, he's involved with the Jesus Seminar. He's involved with that group that Time Magazine and the New York Times keeps putting on the front page who say, you can't trust the Gospels, you have to read the secret Gospels that the church is hiding from you. They say you got to read the Gospel of Thomas to know the real Jesus. You got to read the Gospel of Mary to know the real Jesus. That's coming from a group that is both composed of some serious scholars and random folks like the director of RoboCop. That's what we talked about last week. That's one side of this coin. People say, you can't know the real Jesus from the Gospels. You have to read blank. For the Da Vinci Code people and the Jesus Seminar people, they say, you have to read the secret Gospels. But here's the other side of the same coin. A lot of very good, very serious historians who just happen to not be Christians say, if you want to know the real Jesus, you have to look at these secular, non-biblical sources that talk about it. They say if you want to know the historical Jesus, you have to look outside the Bible at the non-biblical sources that are available. That's a much less ridiculous claim. It's still at least half false, because if you want to know the real Jesus, you need to ask Matthew about it. If you want to know the real Jesus, you need to ask Mark. You need to ask Luke. You need to ask John. They'll give you a full, vivid, healthy, complete picture of the real Jesus. You cannot get a full, complete, vivid picture of the real Jesus from the purely historical sources. You need the four Gospels. You need the biblical accounts of Jesus. And yet, this is a claim we could take much more seriously than the secret gospel claim. Because these are not full ones. These are not ridiculous, right? These are not fabrications that were written out by cults in the 3rd and 4th and 5th century, like the so-called secret Gospels were. These are serious historical reporting by serious ancient historians. And so today, we want to look at the serious historical reporting done by the serious ancient historians from the 1st century that are available to us. The first one we want to talk about is Josephus. We want to talk about what Josephus tells us about Jesus. Now, a little bit of background on Josephus. He is the one that you are probably the most likely to have heard of this group. Josephus was a Jewish historian in the 1st century. He was born in AD 37. So he was born just a couple of years after the death of Jesus, or maybe a couple of years before the death of Jesus, because his death could have been anywhere from about AD 30 to about AD 40. We don't know exactly when. So Josephus was born right there in that same time frame. He was a military commander who eventually left his post and became kind of an academic. He became a Jewish historian. So he would chronicle the daily life of Jews living in the Roman Empire. in the first century. He would chronicle military history. So we would follow along with the Roman military. He would chronicle what happens in such and such battle. He would chronicle what happens in those battles. Then he would go back home, and when he wasn't out like with the military, or when he wasn't out reporting on what the Roman Senate was doing, he would go home and he would talk with all the religious leaders there in the Jewish communities back home, and he would write about them. So almost everything we know about the Pharisees, we know from the reporting of Josephus. Almost everything we know about the Sadducees, we know from the reporting of Josephus. Almost everything we know about the Essenes, that was kind of a Jewish sect that lived way out in the wilderness away from everybody else. I know that actually sounds kind of tempting, right? But the Jewish Essenes, everything we know about them, we know from Josephus. Actually, John the Baptist, a biblical character, he's in the first few chapters of most of the Gospels. John the Baptist, according to Josephus, was an Essene. He was part of that sect out there in the wilderness, and he wrote pretty extensively about John the Baptist during his life. And so quite a bit of what we know about the Jewish world in the first century, we know from Josephus. He was a Jewish historian. And so back when you were in high school, reading your high school history book, when you got to the section on first century Rome, and there would have been a section, even if you can't remember it, because it's been a couple years. When you got to that section, basically everything your high school history book said about the Jewish people living in Rome at the time, this is where they got it. They got it from Josephus. Josephus is considered to be one of our most valuable historical sources for understanding both ancient Rome and ancient Judaism. And it just so happens that there are two places where Josephus talks specifically about Jesus. Y'all remember this? There's a little bit of controversy about the second one. We'll talk about that. But there are two specific places where Josephus, the eminent Jewish historian who gave us most of what we know about the Jews in first century Rome, there are two places where he talks specifically about Jesus. I want to read those to you. These both come from a series of works called the Jewish Antiquities. The first quote, Josephus says in the Jewish Antiquities, he says, "The high priest Ananias convened a meeting of the Sanhedrin and brought before them a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned." That's the first thing Josephus says when he mentions Jesus. I'm going to read that for you again. This is a quote from the preeminent Jewish historian of the first century. He says, "The high priest Ananias convened a meeting of the Sanhedrin and brought before them a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned." So he's narrating the death of James. Remember the book of James in the New Testament? That was the first book of the Bible that I preached through when I first got here. I had no idea what I was doing. I would do it totally differently if I preached through it now, but, hey, you learn, right? So it's the first book I preached through when we got here. It's one of the most neglected books of the New Testament. That's why I picked it, but it was written by James, the brother of Jesus. It's very short. You could read it in an afternoon. You could actually read it while you eat lunch after you leave here today, if you wanted to. But Josephus is talking about how the author of James dies. And how does the author of James die? The high priest Ananias Ananias is there in the Gospels. He was a kind of the assistant to who? To Caiaphas, right? The high priest Ananias learned about James. He's in the process of trying to snuff out the early church. And so he drags James before the Sanhedrin. That's the high court of all the Jewish religious leaders there in Jerusalem. He drags them before the Sanhedrin, and he has them stoned on account of breaking the law, on account of the fact that they are Christians. And so Josephus says, one more time, just to give you the exact quote, once again trying to burn it into your head, right? He says, the high priest Ananias convened a meeting of the Sanhedrin and brought before them a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned. So, that's what Josephus says. What do we learn from what Josephus just said? What are some things you noticed from what he just said?
He was willing to die for the same thing Jesus did.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
He believed in his brother. Yes.
Yes. So James was willing to die for the same beliefs that Jesus did, because James believed in his brother, Jesus, right? So that tells us a few things.
So I thought I had read when they were growing up,
Yeah.
that they didn't believe Jesus.
You read correctly. So growing up, James did not believe in his brother Jesus, but Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7, he says, then the Lord appeared to James and the rest of his brothers. Apparently, at some point, it's never narrated for us, but apparently, Jesus appeared to James and the rest of his brothers after his resurrection. So his brothers would have watched their brother, who they believed was a fraud. They would have watched him die. They would have watched him be buried. They would have seen a very dead Jesus go into the tomb. And then either a few days or maybe a month later, because apparently Jesus was on earth for about 40 days after his resurrection. But sometime during that 40 days, apparently Jesus showed up and said, hey, I'm back. Got any chips? Or something like that, right? He would have appeared to James and the rest of his brothers and had kind of an I told you so moment, right? And we don't really know much about the rest of his brothers. We have Jude as well. James and Jude are both understood to have been brothers of Jesus. But at the very least, James and Jude, among the rest of his brothers, because they would have had large families back then, but James and Jude became important leaders in the church because they came to believe in their brother, Jesus. And so when we fast forward to AD 64 or so, I think is when this would have happened, Josephus says the high priest Ananias convened a meeting of the Sanhedrin and brought before them a man named James. He brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned. So, pretend you don't know anything about the rest of the Bible. You've learned a couple of things from what Josephus just said. First things first, you've learned that according to the preeminent Jewish historian of the first century, Jesus existed. Obvious, right? But you know that according to the guy who told us most of what we know about the Jewish people from the first century, a Jewish man named Jesus existed. 1. 2, this man, Jesus, had at least one brother, right? James. And that James, his brother, and apparently a decent-sized group of others believed that Jesus was the Christ. Forgive my handwriting. That's what we learn from this first Josephus passage. That in the first century, there was a man named Jesus who had a brother named James. And that James and others believed that Jesus was the Christ, the anointed one. And that James was so confident that his brother Jesus was the Christ, he was willing to be stoned to death. He was willing to let a crowd of Jewish religious leaders and peasants throw gigantic rocks at him until he bled out, because he believed his brother was the Christ. Even if you don't know anything at all about the Bible, if you have literally never heard of the Bible, you learn from this Josephus passage that there was a man named Jesus with a brother named James who believed he was the Christ, along with a group of other people who believed that so confidently they were ready to be killed. So far, this is what we know about the historical Jesus. We're going to learn a lot more. But so far, just having dipped our toes into the first person, we know this about the historical Jesus. You don't need a Bible to know that Jesus existed. He had a brother named James, and he was believed to be the Christ. But it gets better, because this is kind of the shallow end of what Josephus tells us about Jesus. Anybody remember the second passage from Josephus that Lee Strobel and Edwin Yamauchi talk about? The second passage is called the Testimonium Flavianum, the testimony of Josephus. Yeah, you don't need to know that. It does not matter, right? So Josephus's full name was Josephus Flavius, and so the Testimonium Flavianum, that's the testimony of Flavius, or the testimony of Josephus. Now, there's a bit of a controversy about the Testimonium Flavianum. Does anybody remember what that controversy is?
They was concerned about it being doctored.
Yes, exactly. So,
It was a word they used. I can't remember.
there are a few words. One of them is interpolations.
Yeah.
That's your $10 word for today. You learned the word interpolations today. So an interpolation is what we call it when something is written, right? So like, the cat is mine. Right, so that's a sentence, right? Now, if I came in and I added something to that sentence, like the cannibalistic cat is mine, that's an interpolation. I have changed the meaning of that sentence, right? Used to be I had a cat, that's normal. Now I have a cannibalistic cat, right? Now I have a cat that you got to protect your cat from, for some reason, you know? Actually, honestly, all cats are probably cannibalistic. If a cat dies around another cat, leave it long enough, it's going to eat the other cat, right? So I've changed the meaning of this sentence by interpolating cannibalistic. So the cannibalistic cat is mine now, right? Now, if I added even more, I could interpolate even more. I could say the cannibalistic cat is a landmine. Now, the cannibalistic cat is a landmine, so now you have to worry even more about it, right? Because you've got this cat that wants to eat your cat, but if you step on my cat, it's going to blow you up, right? Now I have a very dangerous cat. I mean, all cats are dangerous because all cats are evil, right? I firmly believe that. All dogs are Christians, all cats are Satanists. Not like the normal kind of Satanists where they're just atheists who kind of get into, the imagery of Satan, like legit, like the Satanists you see in scary movies from the 90s when everybody was afraid of them, right? Like during the Satanic Panic, right? That kind of Satanist. But yeah, the cannibalistic cat is a landmine, right? These are interpolations that change the meaning of the original sentence. I know this is the content you come to church for. But the second Josephus quote has a bit of an issue. The issue being that it seems very much like the second Josephus quote has interpolations. Has anybody turned to the spot in the book?
I see the word zealots. Is that what
You talk about where the actual.
Yeah, or it gets to that second Josephus quote. You're there?
Well, I hope I am. I think I am.
Okay. Can you read out the second Josephus quote for me?
About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the high standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the third day he appeared to them restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvelous things about him, and the tribe of Christians so called after him has still to this day not disappeared.
Okay, so if that quote were authentic, that would be great, right? That would be excellent if that quote were legit. Couple of problems. It is very well established from much better attested historical sources that Josephus was not a Christian. Josephus did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Josephus did not believe that Jesus was the Christ. He did not believe the claims that the Christians made. Origen, a very kind of well-regarded, he was a sort of a legendary church father in the 4th century. He griped consistently that Josephus had never taken the plunge, that he had never become a Christian, that he didn't believe in the resurrection, that he didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Josephus, very specifically, is not a Christian. And so, how likely do you think it is that Josephus said, Jesus was a wise man, if indeed he can be called a man, he was the Christ? Think Josephus really said that? Probably not. Beyond all of that, there's pretty good evidence that quite a few of those phrases were not there in the original text of that Josephus quote. So, if indeed he could be called a man, there's pretty good evidence that that was not actually part of the original text of this Josephus passage. He was the Christ. There's pretty good evidence that that was not actually part of the original Josephus text. We can walk through quite a bit. There are sections of that text that it's almost certain are what? Interpolations. That version of the Josephus text is the cannibalistic cat is a landmine version. To get anything of historical value, we need the cat is mine version. Here's the good news. They don't talk about it in the book, but historians are pretty certain that we have that. Because even though the existing Greek texts of that Josephus passage, that would have been the original language, but that doesn't mean these are the original copies, right? These are all late copies of that Josephus text. The Greek versions of that Josephus text are from probably the 8th or 9th century, so 800 or 900 years after that was originally written. So plenty of time for some Christians to go in and add some cannibalism, some landmines to the cat, right? But we have the Arabic text, which is maybe from the 4th, maybe from the 5th, maybe from the 6th century. There's an Arabic translation of that Josephus text that we have that is from either a few hundred years or maybe 500 years earlier than the Greek texts that we have. And guess what's different about the Arabic text? It doesn't have the suspicious stuff. I'm going to read you the much earlier Arabic translation of that Josephus text. Y'all ready? In the Arabic translation, Josephus says this: "At this time, there was a wise man who was called Jesus. And his conduct was good. And he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and die. And those who have become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders." That's about 1,000% less suspicious than the version of the quote I just had Debbie read, isn't it? That sounds like something that conceivably the preeminent Jewish historian of the 1st century might actually have said, doesn't it? And so historians are fairly certain that the Greek text of the Testimonium Flavianum is interpolated, and they're fairly certain that the Arabic text is not. The general consensus among historians is that the Arabic text of the Testimonium Flavianum is legitimate. So, let's take a look at the legitimate version of the Testimonium Flavianum, and let's see what we can learn about the historical Jesus. I'm going to read it to you again, just like I did that first passage. Here is the Arabic text of the Testimonium Flavianum. He says, "At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who have become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders." So, what do we learn about Jesus from that passage of Josephus?
He was seen 3 days after.
Yeah. According to the preeminent Jewish historian who was not a Christian and taught us most of what we know about Judaism in the 1st century, the historical Jesus was seen 3 days after his crucifixion. That's exactly right. Now, very obvious jumping off point from that, the historical Jesus was crucified. What else? I know there was a ton in that passage, so it's hard to catch everything. He says the historical Jesus was known to be virtuous and have good conduct. The historical Jesus was famous for his good conduct and virtue. The same way, Josephus in that same text tells us he had a large enough following to be noteworthy. He had a large enough following to justify Josephus' notice, right? Beyond that, just like before, many people believed that Jesus was the Messiah that the Jewish prophets had looked forward to. He alludes to that at the end there. He says, accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah that the prophets looked forward to. There's a textual variant in there where in some other copies of that it says, like, accordingly, many believe that perhaps he was the Messiah. That's actually probably the more likely reading. And so we know from Josephus that Jesus existed. He had a brother named James. People believed he was the Christ. He was crucified. After his crucifixion, he was seen 3 days later, and I should have mentioned this earlier. During his life, he was well known as a virtuous man with good conduct. Pretend you don't know anything about the Bible. Pretend you have never read the Gospels. Pretend you have never heard the name of Jesus before. Just from these two passages from Josephus, the preeminent Jewish historian of the first century, you know that there was a man named Jesus with a brother named James who was known to be virtuous and have good conduct, that many people believed was the Christ, the Messiah, who was crucified and then was apparently seen 3 days later after his crucifixion. This is what we know without opening our Bibles. But it's not all we know without opening our Bibles. These next three are going to go quite a bit faster. There's a lot less to talk about with each of them, but I want to talk a little bit about Tacitus. You guys remember Tacitus from a few weeks ago? We talked about a work of his called The Annals of Imperial Rome. Remember that one? Tacitus was a Roman historian. He was kind of like Josephus. He was one of the preeminent Roman historians. In your high school history book, quite a bit of what you learn about Rome from the first century came from where? From Tacitus. Tacitus tells us most of what we know about first century Rome. And so when Tacitus tells us about such and such battle that took place on such and such date under such and such emperor, historians typically trust him. When Tacitus tells us about such and such drama that was happening in the Roman Senate at the time, historians typically trusted. When Tacitus tells us about this or that emperor and who this or that emperor was sleeping with and who this or that emperor had assassinated and so on and so forth, historians typically believe him. Tacitus is one of the most well-regarded, most trusted, most eminent historians in Rome of the first century. And at least one time that we know of, Tacitus talks specifically about Jesus. I'm going to read what Tacitus writes about Jesus to you. Just to set the context, there was a massive fire in the city of Rome. Remember the fire of Rome? You hear about that in high school. You know that there's this saying, right? Nero fiddled while Rome burned, right? He was playing his fiddle while Rome burned. That's an example now. Every time there's some kind of crisis happening in America and the president is playing golf, we say, oh, it's like Nero fiddling while Rome burned, right? It's actually a silly thing because frequently there's nothing that the president could do if he stopped playing golf, right? But, that's a saying we tend to use. Nero fiddled while Rome burned. There was a massive fire in Rome in the year 64 AD, and everybody blamed Nero. We have no idea if Nero was actually responsible for the fire, but everybody saw him and they said, why didn't he do more? And so the crowds were just agitated, right? They were chanting death to Nero, so on and so forth. And so Nero needed what? He needed a scapegoat, right? That's what politicians do, right? When things are going bad on a politician's watch, they say, it's not my fault, it's the immigrants, right? Or they say, it's not my fault, it's the gays. Or they say, it's not my fault, it's so-and-so. They look for a scapegoat. Nero was exactly the same. Who do you think Nero's scapegoat was? Yeah. Nero scapegoated the Christians. He scapegoated a tiny sect with maybe a few thousand followers at that point in time that nobody understood and everybody hated. And he said, the fire of Rome was their fault. Here's what Tacitus writes. Tacitus says, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pled guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred of mankind. There's a lot in there. Once again, these are kind of long quotes. But what does that quote from Tacitus tell you about Jesus? He gives us some details about Jesus in there. I'm going to read it to you again. Listen carefully for every little detail that Tacitus kind of spills out about Jesus. Tacitus says, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pled guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred of mankind. So, what details did Tacitus drop about Jesus there?
That he suffered.
Yeah.
Extreme penalty.
Jesus suffered the extreme penalty. Now, the extreme penalty, that was kind of a shorthand that they used in Rome for, what do you think? Crucifixion. Yeah. Crucifixion was kind of in polite company, kind of the way that back in the day, I can't remember who it was telling me this. They were saying, like, you're the first person who's ever said the word circumcision from the pulpit in Mount Zion. And I was like, how did they talk about any of the thousands of verses that have circumcision in it? And they were like, I think they just read past it or something like that. They used a euphemism. They were like, we've never even heard the word pregnant. They would say, like, with child or something like that, right? So there are words that culturally back then you would not say in polite company, right? Now there's a problem with that. Like if you have a cultural tradition that literally stops you from reading the Bible, there's a problem with your cultural tradition, right? Same kind of way, prudishness about that kind of thing probably caused a lot of women to suffer in a lot of ways because they couldn't articulate problems that they were having, right? I bet a lot of pregnancies miscarried. I bet a lot of abuse carried on. I bet a lot of children died early in childbirth because we literally didn't have language to describe the problems that we're having because we wouldn't let ourselves say things like circumcision, pregnant, sex, right? Stuff like that, right? We wouldn't say these words, and as a result, all kinds of bad things happen. So there's a problem with that breed of prudishness. It's not just prudish, it's also literally harmful. That's part of why, as you've noticed, the Bible is not prudish, right? Like if we believe the Bible, and the Bible is not prudish, what business do we have being prudish, right? But there was prudishness back in ancient Rome too. And so they literally wouldn't say the word crucifixion around women. They were like, if we say the word crucifixion around a woman, she's going to faint. She's going to have to get her smelling salts, right? And so they wouldn't say words like crucifixion around women a lot of times. And so they would say things like the extreme penalty. And so Tacitus says Jesus received the extreme penalty under Pontius Pilate. So, we can add another thing to our quiver. Tacitus just confirmed that the person responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus was who? Pontius Pilate. A whole lot of people, a whole lot of scholars and others think that most of what the gospel accounts say about the crucifixion of Jesus is probably fictional. A lot of it's probably made up. And so they look and they say, Pilate probably didn't actually say that. Pilate probably didn't actually do that. Pilate probably wasn't really involved at any serious level. And yet Tacitus says that Jesus was given the extreme penalty by who? Pontius Pilate. What else? What can you remember? What did Tacitus tell us?
He said arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. I would assume that would be pleaded guilty that they believe.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's actually a specific word in here that I think is so interesting. Tacitus says, essentially, that by the middle of the 1st century, so by AD 64, within 30 years of the death of Jesus, maybe less, there was already a movement of people that he says were superstitiously devoted to Jesus. That's a really interesting word to use, isn't it? They were superstitiously devoted to Jesus. There are a lot of cults, right? And there are a lot of cults of personality. There are some cults of personality, people who are absolutely wildly beloved by their followers, but there's nothing supernatural involved, right?